Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the exposure trifecta of manual photography. Exposure is, it relates to how light or dark the image may appear, but more specifically, it's how much light that actually hits your camera sensor. Exposure is controlled by three things which make up the trifecta, and that is ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So these things can not only control how light or dark your image may appear, but also a few other things like depth of field, blur, and even the graininess that an image may have. But we're going to get into that in a little bit. With that being said, let's get started. So the first element we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Shutter speed determines how long the camera shutter will remain open for, which affects the amount of light that gets let in. It's also measured in fractions of a second. If you want to think about it like this, shutter speed is also how long it takes for the camera to take the actual picture. If you use a very slow shutter speed, means that the sensor will be exposed to light for a longer period of time and let a lot more light hit it. So if you don't compensate for it, your image may look too overexposed and too blurry, because as the sensor is exposed, as you move objects around, you'll see a ghost trail on your actual image. You can use shutter speed to your advantage as well though. For example, if you're taking pictures of moving objects, such as vehicles, people playing sports, pets for example, using a very quick, short shutter speed will essentially freeze your subject in time and won't create that blur. But you can also use shutter speed to create the blur if that's the creative approach you're wanting to take. And you see this a lot in long exposure photography. For example, the trailing lights, you see cars traveling down the highway, you see the trailing lights. I'll probably put an example up. The second element of our trifecta is aperture. Aperture determines the size of the opening through which light enters the lens, and it's kind of similar to the pupil in our eye. The idea is that the wider aperture you have, the more light you let in. Aperture is measured in f-stops, and it looks something like f8 or f16. F-stops and aperture size have like an inverse relationship. So a small f-stop number will give you a wider aperture, and a large f-stop number will give you a narrow aperture. If you want, think of f-stop as fractions. 1 over 8 would be greater than 1 over 16, right? But if that's confusing, just think of it simply as small f-stop, big aperture, big f-stop, small aperture. Take a look at this video that I took of the aperture in my own camera. As you can see, the aperture is becoming more narrow. This is because I'm increasing the f-stop number. More narrow aperture because of a larger f-stop. You can use aperture to also manipulate the depth of field in your image. Using a wider aperture will introduce background blur. You can use this to emphasize your subject, for example in this cactus image here. You can also use a narrow aperture to make your background in focus. Take a look at this windmill image here. You're going to see that the plants in the foreground are in focus, and also the windmill in the background is in focus too. Also, if you're taking any landscape shots where you want details in the background, a narrow aperture would be pretty useful as well. The final element to our trifecta is ISO. ISO controls your camera's sensitivity to light. So using a higher ISO means your image will get brighter, but this would come at the cost of introducing graininess or noise into your final image. Compare this to using a microphone. If you can't hear someone speaking into the mic, you're going to increase its gain. What you're going to get is a much louder voice, but also some static and unwanted sounds that may take away from the quality of the audio. So the same applies with ISO in photography. To maintain the highest clarity and sharpness to your image, you're going to want to use the lowest ISO possible for your given conditions. If you're out in daylight, using a low ISO of 100, 200 depending on your camera may be best. But of course this isn't always possible. If you're taking low light shots, a higher ISO just may be unavoidable. And that's the trade-off you're going to need to make if you can't compensate with increased light or do the other two settings that we just mentioned before. Take a look at this flower image here. If you look a bit closely, you can notice that grain and noise I was talking about earlier, which comes with using a higher ISO value. Now I do understand that was quite a bit of information to take in, but I'm sure with a little bit of practice, you can get the hang of what settings to change and how to change them. But for now, here's a couple of guidelines to at least get you started in the right direction. I'd begin by choosing two settings in our trifecta to change. This could be based off of the location I'm in or the effects I'd like to achieve. If I'm outside with an ample amount of light, I'd start by setting a low ISO of say 100 or 200. If I'd like to achieve a depth of field effect like a background blur, I'd set a wide aperture with a small f-stop number. If I'd like to get a clear background or I'm taking a landscape shot for example, I'd set a narrow aperture with a large f-stop number. If I'd like to capture a moving object, I would set a quick shutter speed like 2/50ths of a second or 500ths of a second. That last setting, however, whatever setting remains, can be decided through simple trial and error. take a couple of test shots and just adjust the setting as necessary. If your camera has a light meter, make reference to that. The light meter will tell you the relative exposure of your image and can help you fine-tune your settings. Right before I end off, it is that time of year as the winter holidays draw closer and closer. This year has been rather rough on everyone, and celebrating the end of the year with family and friends may be difficult due to the guidelines that we need to follow. I believe it's during times like these that we should consider extending a helping hand to brighten the lives of those impacted the hardest. Please consider supporting your local food bank, as many are running holiday food drives around this time of year. Also, many organizations are trying to bring smiles to the faces of many children across the country by raising toys to give out during the holiday season. One of the charities involved is the Salvation Army that is running the Toy Mountain. And as many do say, it is the season of giving. So that wraps up today's video on the exposure trifecta. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you on the next one.